Something at the beginning, Bilal?
Yes, I will. I'm planning to. So, hello and welcome. My name is Biljana Čirić, and I'm founder of What Could Should Curating Do. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge Bunurong and Urunjeri people, traditional custodians of the land where I am now, and pay my respect to their past, present, and emerging. Today's lecture is part of the What Could Should Curating Do curatorial program that we are running at the moment, thinking how to practice the care within current working conditions. And Ekaterina Degot and David Riff are our mentors of the program, among others. Tonight's lecture, Ekaterina Degot and David Riff will speak about their curatorial experience and the challenges working at steirischer herbst, and I hope I'm pronouncing this properly. It's annual festival of contemporary art that emerged in 1968. It's an interdisciplinary festival with no exhibition space, and its focus has been often on performance and interventions in the public space with a strong political touch. The lecture will focus on the current edition under pandemic restrictions, trying to reinvent the festival as a fictitious media under the name Paranoia TV. And now I will introduce Ekaterina Degot and David. Ekaterina Degot is speaking to us out of Graz. She's an art historian, researcher, and curator, focusing on aesthetics and socio-political issues in Russia and Eastern Europe from 19th century to the post-Soviet era. She began her 5-year tenure as a director and chief curator of the festival in 2018. Between 2014 to 2017, Degot was artistic director of Academy of Arts of the World in Cologne. Among other shows, she curated the first Ural Industrial Biennial in Yekaterinburg in 2010, together with David Riff and Cosmin Kostinas, that I had privilege curating 2 editions later, and headed the first Bergen Assembly with Riff in 2013. David Riff is speaking to us from Berlin. He's a writer, translator, artist, curator, and former member of art group Stodelat. He has been a curator at the steirischer herbst since 2018. Among other exhibitions, he co-curated first Ural Industrial Biennial in Yekaterinburg together with Ekaterina and Cosmin Kostinas, and headed the first Bergen Assembly together with Degot in 2013. Over the last decade, he has been translating and researching the work of Soviet aesthetic philosopher Mikhail Lifshitz, about whom he made a large-scale exhibition in Moscow in Garage in 2018. So just to acknowledge a few partners of the project, I would like to thank, first of all, my colleague, Aigerin Kapar, for all amazing work she does, to Austrian Cultural Forum, who has been supporting many of our things, including the curatorial program, and the partners of the co-streaming, the CCALT platform out of Belgrade, including our partner of this year's program, Duke University in Kunshan in Shanghai. In terms of the housekeeping, Ekaterina and David are going to speak for about 1 hour, and then we will have around 15 minutes for your questions. The lecture is going to be recorded, and we will post it on our YouTube channel later. And please, during the Q&A, post your questions in a chat, wherever you are watching it, whether is it in a Zoom or through a Facebook stream, so we can collect all the questions and ask our speakers. So without further ado, Ekaterina, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So the plan is I will have to give some context also for the previous editions of my term of steirischer Herbst. And then we'll switch to the current pandemic edition of Paranoia TV. And then I'll give the word to David, who will add anything he wants and mostly speak about Paranoia TV film program. So as I discovered, not just steirischer Herbst, but even what is Austria and what is Graz has to be explained in a nutshell. So as we have a very international, company of people here. So Austria is a very interesting place, as its name actually, Österreich actually means that it's just eastern part of German-speaking world. And this is how it was understanding itself for many centuries, before it became part of a much bigger, actually, entity, the Habsburg Empire, which at some point was spreading itself up to Spain and, of course, all over the Eastern Europe. Till in 1919, the country suddenly shrank to a small place. So the identity of Austria is a very complex one because of this history. And since, as I said, there was a very strong feeling of belonging to the German-speaking world between World War I and World War II, actually, the whole population, politically, every party, with some very, very few exceptions, like communists, actually were aiming at becoming part of Germany again for different reasons, like progressively or in a right-wing sense. So this was the whole country was just waiting to become part of Germany. And this is why the Anschluss, something which is interpreted in different ways, like when the moment when Austria became part of German Nazi Reich, came very naturally and very willingly. So they joined the club very, very willingly. So during those years from 39 to 45, Austria did not exist as a country. There was no such a country. It was part of Nazi Reich. But this part of Austrian history is now not completely erased, but they're very, very much sidelined. They don't like to talk about it. So the post-war reception of this history is very different from the one that happened in Germany. I'm not talking about, how deeply this feeling of denazification, is in Germany. This is something to debate, but there was no strong state politics of denazification in Austria. And these whole stories tend to be, put under the table and also in relation to Holocaust. So Austria does not really, so this is one of the myths where the left wing in Austria, which the left wing in Austria still fights, is the myth of victimhood. So Austria that understands itself as a victim of Nazi regime, although this was definitely not the case, and of course shares responsibility. So this is one of the issues that is very interesting here working in Austria, and myself and David and my almost the entire team were all foreigners. Some of us are from Germany, some of us are from Eastern Europe, and we are approaching this context from outside. And I'm the very first foreign artistic director of the festival. Then Graz, what is Graz? Graz is in this country of Austria. Graz it's at the border with Eastern Europe. So as you can imagine, Austria has borders with everybody, like Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and at the south eastern corner, there is Steiermark or Styria. So the steirischer Herbst means actually autumn in Styria. So that's this region with the capital and regional capital of Graz, which always has understood itself as a fortress against the other. Who was the other? At some point, there were some Hungarians, bandits, you know, in, I don't know, 14th century, when was it? Then there were Turks, of course. There was never a siege of Graz, but there were sieges of Vienna, as you know, several of them, and quite serious ones. And the fear of Turks is very strong, kind of, in the subconsciousness. Then, of course, it became socialist Yugoslavia, with whom there were very interesting relation. At some point, the border, there was this notion of green border that was like semi-open with Slovenia. But still, so it was, so this feeling of the other against whom the fortress is built. The fortress doesn't exist anymore physically because it was destroyed by Napoleon. So should have had something like in Salzburg. They regret it till now that there is no such a tourist attraction. But so it's very, so this also, I think, is very symbolic that this fortress is completely imaginary. It doesn't exist. You can imagine it on top of, there is a hill in the center of town, but there is no fortress. But the feeling of being a fortress against some other is very strong. Even if the current situation of Graz is that like every second person you see in the street is either Bosnian or Slovenian or Croatian. Or Serbian, of course. So, but it is, there are even some black people. There are, of course, lots of Kurds, but this is completely unacknowledged. It's even a little bit unacknowledged in Vienna, which is also very, very multicultural, but not really acknowledged in Graz. The Graz still has this completely, you know, fictitious, self-delusional, patriarchal, all-white image of itself, which is completely contradicts their reality. And so this is also the reality we are working with. And last but not least, steirischer herbst. So in this situation, where in the 60s, the Nazis were still in power, at least in cultural power in Austria, very strongly. There were still all the university professors, all like museum directors, still the 80s were former Nazis, still having a very strong influence. And a very provincial town on Graz. I also didn't say that it's, but it's probably clear that it's a very provincial town, which has actually better weather than Vienna. This is why all the old, you know, apparatchiks from Vienna and also all the militaries from Vienna were retiring in Graz. It's the case. The Graz is to come and to stay for most of the people because there are nice vineyards, and the weather is better than in Vienna. So in this conservative place, in the 60s, artists and writers started to create an alternative culture that was, what is interesting to say from the very beginning, also supported by politicians, by conservative Catholic politicians in the first place. Some of them were also former Nazi, but feeling some sort of a redemption. Some of them were anti-Nazi, but mostly anti-Nazi were coming from the socialist democratic background. So this is how they created first the triennial under the name Trigon, where art from Yugoslavia, Italy, and Austria was shown. And then for Stadtpark, the local institutions that started as a literary club. And then in 68, the Festival Steirischer Herbst. So since then it exists every year. And it had very different periods with very different directors. So there were periods even without a curator. There were periods with curators who were focusing on musical theater. There were periods where Peter Weibel, who was not a curator of Steirischer Herbst, but played an important role doing yearly exhibitions in Neue Galerie. At that point, Neue Galerie was part of this constellation. Then there were very different periods. And before me, there was a very long period of about 20 years where Steirischer Herbst was concentrating almost exclusively on theater, becoming a festival, basically. So, and this is important for how we approached it with my intendants. So I now did the third edition together with David and other curators. And it was important not, well, one can say to break some expectations of a theater festival, but at the same time to embrace them as well. Because what we are doing, I would say it's not, I'm saying sometimes that this is some sort of an art biennial, but happening every year, but not every 2 years. But this is not completely true because it's something in between a biennial and a festival. So the difference is that biennial is still an exhibition and based on, you know, objects or installations placed in space. Usually, like everybody has this fantasy of Venice Arsenale. So a huge space where, you know, artworks are placed. And this is what we did in Yekaterinburg, I guess you as well. That we do not have. Like we do not have such a place. To rent it, you know, would cost, you know, all the budget of the festival. So that is not on the table. I'm also not that much interested in that, I would say. So the festival is something happening not in space, but in time. A festival, a theater festival, the structure is that it's tonight is a premiere of something which is repeated like 3 or 5 times if it's very popular. Then there is another thing. Every, you know, every event costs separate money and also costs a lot. You know that before me, the tickets to a single event were like 25 euros very often. You know, you can imagine what it is if you want to visit several and also with your partner, let's say. So it's actually theater festival. It's an expensive thing for, I would say, kind of rich, you know, semi-rich middle class, you know, theater lovers. And we had to break this, introducing the festival pass that gave access, not this year, but you know, in the previous years that gave access to everything. And also trying to navigate in both in space and time. So I still, what I appreciate, orientation. And that became clear when we first tried to introduce what is called, you know, press preview or professional preview. This is what every biennial has, you know, right? Of course, the first couple of days, which are only accessible to press and professionals. And we tried to introduce this, and then it turned out that the theater director said, like, wait a second, you mean we will be performing for the press only? No, that doesn't work. That is called general probe. This is not what we can do. You know, we can, so the theater people, and I must say, I have enormous respect for that, cannot work without audience. While in visual arts, as you know, to make a photo of an installation, we're asking the photographer to come at 8 in the morning, where there's guaranteed nobody. So because everybody wants to have a photo of a clean, pure installation without, with very, very few exceptions. This comes naturally for like our field. And there is a clash with this, you know, feeling of the audience as a necessary part of the process for the theater field. So I really wanted to embrace this public aspect and to kind of inject, I would say, this public feeling, but even to increase it to the art field. The previous festival did not really, I would say, use this public aspect because, as I said, they only had those, mostly had those, you know, things indoors and for the either invited public or with very expensive tickets. This is why the first thing I wanted to do was to move the opening to the public space. And so I'll show maybe some images now and quickly go through the history of festivals. So the first, still we took the idea of the biennials, you know, to going thematic and to really trying to address. So my tenure is of 5 years, and this all the topics, they are spread over those 5 years. They began in 18, and still we are exploring them. So the first edition was called Volksfronten, and this is still with us. Volksfronten was in German deliberately, because the word Volk, which means people, but has a very different roots, like people, populace, has this, you know, kind of reference of democracy, of a Rome, it's a Roman, you know, sound, while folk sounds very, you know, ethnically, and was, you know, misexplored by Nazis. And this is why even, today, German-speaking people, they shiver when they hear the word folk, even if it's totally legal in Volkskunde Museum, things like that. But this is it's an unpleasant word. And so we gave this unpleasant Germanness to the Popular Front. As you know, Popular Front, it was a united France, but doesn't exist more because we do not have the United Front, unfortunately, because we are split in an awful way between our different positions, ethnically, politically, everybody is supposed to have an identity which is different from someone else, and to build solidarities is very difficult. At the same time, we wanted also to address the potential until now, this potential of the popular, also in art that is maybe lost today. So just a couple of images. So the opening, we invited a legendary American group, Bread and Puppets, for an outdoor procession, and which was called Insurrection Mass. And you see there were lots of people. What was most pleasant that people were watching from their balconies, from their windows, while we were walking through the town in the unprivileged part of the town. That was a very strong moment. This was a work I'm very proud about. This is a work of because it started very casually, but became very, very much to the point. It's Yoshinori Niwa is a young Japanese artist working in Vienna, who is actually, he doesn't even play, he is that sort of an outsider who does not really understand Austria, just trying to understand. So he put this container on the central square, Hauptplatz of Graz, in front of the Rathaus, where all the politicians are sitting. And it says, you don't know what to do with the Nazi uniform of your grand uncle. You are too sentimental to burn it, but it's too unpleasant to keep it. You are confused, just bring it to me. So he put this container to collect all this stuff. And it started as a joke, but it turned out that actually for Austrian people in my team is really exactly the problem. So which would not be in Germany, because, but of course the museums do exist. You can actually bring your medals and uniform to a museum. Nobody would object about it, but people feel uneasy because this issue is not resolved. So this is something that functioned well, and we also got, of course, lots of hate speech on Facebook. I'm showing it to show how public we actually started. This is another public performance of Roman Osminkin, so where I kind of had those visions, walking through Graz and seeing some places like these beautiful stairs being built by, World War I war prisoners. So I'm making some public performance in there. So I'm going to show how difficult it was for us with the pandemic this year, because this, feeling of going public was important. So we were also exploring some, important landmarks. This is, for instance, it's an old photo, but it still looks like that. It's a hotel built in 1955, which looks, you might agree with me, as some sort of an Yugoslavian holiday resort, beach hotel, but there is no beach. It's built at the railway station. It represents some social democratic, hopes. At the same time, it's built by a former Nazi architect. So, and we did a public audio artwork on the roof of this with Tony Chakar. Leibach Group was opening the festival, which was a music performance with a reference to Sound of Music, but I will not dwell on that. The second edition was called Grand Hotel Abyss. And it was a little bit prophetic because it was about hedonism in catastrophic times, and catastrophic times actually came. We didn't ask for it. But our focus was actually rather, that was not really understood, but our focus at that time was rather hedonism, because the whole region of Styria promotes itself through the notion of Genuss, which I find very interesting. Genuss in German means pleasure, but with a very strong, culinary feeling. Even if I say that ich genieße Kultur, it sounds like I'm eating culture. So it has this oral, feeling, which was interesting to explore because the whole town is also aesthetically has this aspect of Austrian Baroque, Catholic Baroque, for which this opulence worked also as a political weapon. This is the town of a counter-reformation. Counter-reformation is very important for the history of Austria, where they were fighting. Actually, lots of people died in those. There were pogroms of Protestants there that were very, very harsh. And so this the deprotestanization and counter-reformation was an important part of political and aesthetical history of Austria. So for that event, the opening performance was in Landhaushof. It's a major landmark, and it was a beautiful performance by Zorka Volny, whose actors were impersonating different politicians from different political fields. And this is for the first time, actually, that steirischer herbst explored this very, very politically and aesthetically loaded, part. It's still, of course, the place of the government in the whole land, in the whole region, not just in Graz. So this is a, of course, purpose. We also had an extravagance of performances indoors, and this is Jule Flierl, a German artist who's performing, as you see, with the statue of Beethoven. Also, kind of Beethoven, who's shared, contested between Germany and Austria. Who is he? And like she has this feminist, interesting, move towards him. It's an installation by Jan, kind of real life installation with living bodies also there for one evening by Jakob Lena Knebel, an Austrian artist, Austrian Pavilion next year. She's great. I find so this aesthetics, very heavy aesthetics of hedonism was approached. This time not living bodies by puppets, but by Oscar Murillo, who did an installation. And what you see is actually, believe it or not, this is our office. This is how our office looks like. This is why you can understand where this idea of Grand Hotel Abyss is coming from. And Grand Hotel Abyss is actually a quote from Georg Lukács, and David will say more about it. So this is in our rooms. We also used, at that moment, we were able to use one of the art institutions in Graz, which is Künstlerhaus. And this is a house that was built. And there is a local legend that the house that was built in 1955 was financed by living British troops that were also headquartered in our office. And that was this semi-modernist, semi-kind of British countryside villa. It's a last present of British occupiers that were saying, remain modern, don't go back to Nazis. So it was in some way like anti-Baroque gesture. And we did an interesting combination of works there with a beautiful video installation. Actually, almost all of those works are new, like everything I'm showing are new or a co-production. And this was a new film by Jasmina Cibic about especially the architectural buildings being a present from one country to another. So, and of them there are many. And we are very proud that we had also a new work by Jeremy Deller, who was at that point, of course, was only thinking about Brexit, and he was right to think about it. And he's in a very interesting way approached Brexiteers, actually, in the streets of London, that I appreciated very much, that he's an artist who is not afraid of embracing this populist dimension, really going to people who have no idea of contemporary art and who even think differently than he does. And he had a very interesting conversations with them. So I'm also proud that we had the very first installation in the oeuvre of Artur Zmijewski, who we were talking with him for a long time, you know, what to do in those circumstances, how to approach this Grand Hotel Abyss, what's the political situation in Poland. And nothing actually worked, you know, in terms of a medium, you know, we were nothing, there were nowhere to exhibit. And at some point he said, you know, I'm so depressed. He said, political situation is so awful. I just want to, you know, to build a bunker somewhere in the forest and hide there. And I said, this is what we will do. Precisely, like we will turn just your idea into an installation, and it's not in the forest, but it's in the one shop in Graz. So what you see now, it's all Artur's installation. It's all like total installation, all fake, which he created, some sort of like fake, you know, tailor shop. And there you see very low doors. And if you go through the low doors and you really have to, you know, crawl in there, you're going in the back room, and this is where you see people hiding. So you don't see people, but you see a hiding place for people who are actually Frank meets, you know, contemporary refugees. And then you go out through a different door, and you are back into a normal street of Graz. That was a very, very strong, you know, feeling. We also addressed some of the monuments of Graz. This is a work by Eduard Freudman, who has like a complex story, but this is a monument to the liberation of Graz that was put in 55. And the liberation of Graz did not happen in 45, as you might think, but it's 55 how they think. So the liberation is actually where all the liberator left. So the Austria was occupied, I'm reminding you, from 45 to 55, was divided between 4 occupational forces. Just rewatch The Third Man, you know, to have an idea of how it was in Vienna. Graz was under British occupation. And this is where they actually felt, you know, finally free. And as I said, the Grand Hotel Abyss is actually a quote of Georg Lukács, and David mostly was responsible for this part of the show, our own curatorial, you know, exhibition, and he will tell you more about it. David, can you join us for a couple of words about that?
Yeah, sure. So we were departing from this quote of Georg Lukács devised in 1933 that resounds a bit with his own biography. Maybe you know that Georg Lukács, the famous Marxist philosopher, Hungarian German-speaking Marxist philosopher, was friends with Thomas Mann and actually served as a prototype for one of the characters in The Magic Mountain. So we sort of, in the literary Literaturhaus, the literary house of Graz, we made built a fanciful installation that wasn't so much about Lukács's philosophy as such, but about this character, Lukács, and his peregrinations in the 20th century, and how also a certain notion of, I would say, bourgeois enjoyment of art was always a part of his character, and, you know, appropriating and working through that notion really became a part of his theory. So in a way, we were going from the biography and making fictitious the biography in a very fanciful way through models. There was in the other room of the installation that you see here, there was a big magic mountain, plaster mountain with a little hotel, yes, quite accurately
left
rebuilt. So we were really trying to make this kind of fictitious biographical work, and actually to talk about key issues in the installation and in the work. Also about the history, of course, of revolution and fascism and how they intersect in the 20th century. Just that in short. Mm-hmm. Katja, so you could continue.
Okay, so now switching, so what happened this year? As you see, this aspect of being public, even if it's, you know, it was a very strong effort from our side. Well, it was important to me because as you know, we did the Yekaterinburg Biennial with David. We also did the very first Bergen Triennial. They were very different. I also witnessed many biennials, as you know. This whole idea of biennial in most of the places, excluding maybe, I don't know, Lyon biennial, I have never been there. It's usually based on local art community, planetary, which has some sort of a local followers club. It's an elite. It's very important for Russia. There is a very, I don't know how it was for you, Biljana, but of course, people in Yekaterinburg had, like normal people, they did not really know that there is such a thing as a Yekaterinburg Biennial. Even Manifest in St. Petersburg, it was I was not part of it, but I saw that it is in Hermitage Museum at the very center of Petersburg, and actually nobody in town, with the exception of maybe 100 people, actually knew about it. But it was very much internationally, known. So this is a very, to me, a surrealist, clash between global, aspirations and actually also a very colonial or self-colonizing idea of this, small groups of people, in Soviet Union, those, cosmopolitan artistic elites, they were even calling themselves, members of, London Geographical Club, but which were like this imaginary club. They are forgotten kind of among locals, among natives like Papua people, how they kind of presented it, that they are forgotten in this filiale of Geographic Club. And this feeling of working on two levels, for international, fame and very small local elites, that was, part of, actually, as I said, almost all the biennials I've ever seen, maybe with the exception of São Paulo, that has a very strong, local roots. And this is what we actually do not have in Graz. Actually, if you count art elite from Graz, this is maybe, I don't know, 10 people. Half of them has apartments in Vienna. So there are some art institutions and some of them are very good, even very high international level. But for the opening events, they are bringing buses from Vienna. There is no art school in Graz. But at the same time, steirischer Herbst has a very strong history of local connections to, there is this liberal, middle bourgeois, liberal circles that follow steirischer Herbst since 1968, and they value the progressive ideas, the anti-Nazi, vibe that was always there. And I'm being approached in the street, I'm being recognized, and I'm going through a forest, hoping to, escape from everybody. And then I'm meeting an old lady who says, "Oh, you are relaxing after the festival," So it's a small town which has an audience who are not art professionals. They don't actually care what is postmodernism or whatever, but they have some sort of relation to art. And this is, it's a challenge how to, get them and at the same time to be relevant and important for international audiences, for us, professional audiences. Not to, what I kind of regret in the contemporary art world, and I understand why it happened. The contemporary art world is almost 100% related to academia right now. This is its support group. This is also, work, politically, sometimes even financially. It's related to universities, very good if art schools, but sometimes even university. I can understand why it is so, because it's easier also to, nobody is contesting the necessity of education. Even the right wing, would not say, we should, close all the university. At least I haven't heard anything like that. But they say about the festival, the steirischer Herbst is under huge attacks of the right-wing parties. And, being somehow connected to it helps all of us everywhere. But at the same time, sometimes it creates some sort of a census. The audience feels that in order to attend a festival, they must have a PhD in cultural studies, because this is how works are presented. This is how they are kind of, this whole, field is, we are clever people here. We are very clever, very progressive people, very left-wing, very often, the more left-wing we are, the more often we actually go in this direction of being very, very closed, club. And that creates, and this is a challenge. So how to work with this challenge, especially in a situation where we had a festival almost planned in March, which had to be erased, and we had to build something completely new. So we invented this Paranoia TV, which worked as a film program, but also with some of the things with our mascot, Freud. I'm now passing the word to David very soon, just to show you this was, we still had a space in the center of Graz as some sort of headquarters, where there was this Freud answering questions, where there was an installation where one can sit and relax. At that moment, it was actually, we were in between two lockdowns. It was possible to come there. There were some artist talks. This is by Igor Samolot. About the lockdown in Moscow, you see there is this people hugging. So there is nostalgia of hugging, which is at the center of the thing. And also some political, references on those, screenshots. So we also had in town some, screens showing my opening speech. The opening performance was a socially distant one in cars, in taxis. It was actually a very beautiful performance by Janusz Janša, which it was an audio piece representing a fictitious football match of European, this competition, how it's called, which didn't take place, as you know. We were listening to it moving through town. There were also a couple of performances we were able to do in operas. It was a work by Lulu Obermeyer, who took over an opera just for one evening for a feminist performance. Some other, local, video works. We were able to have small discussions with locals. That was also important for us. Also in church. So this is a work of Thomas Geiger, who represented himself as capitalism actually embodied, and he had a conversation with a shrink, a schoolgirl, and a priest, a progressive priest, actually an interesting figure, typical for Graz. Works with locals, Anna Witt, working with older women in Steiermark, in Styria, in Feldbach. Lawrence Abu Hamdam, audio work in a local supermarket. Vadim Fishkin's work in a park. You see, we had to go outside. That was very successful. It was Akinbode Akinbi. Photo automat, where you were getting, you see this retro style, not just a photo of you, but 3 photos of him. He's a great photographer living in Berlin. And some of the works we distributed through other channels, like for instance, photos by Joanna Piotrowska. They came as a newspaper to people who are ordering food. So we had a deal with a food delivery, and that was about being at home with a text in 4 languages. We did of 4 major languages spoken in Graz. This mirror by Judy Radul, it's an object that we were also distributing, a mirror with a hole where you can do a selfie and still seeing something which is around you. A book by Roy Rosen, a coloring book for adults, a poignant story about him being sick with cancer, but also a very poetic story fitting, our strange times. And I also commissioned 2 maps. So with this, idea, dystopian idea that we will never be able to travel again. So I commissioned Graz, making an imaginary map of Vienna, how they remember it, and artists in Vienna making a map of Graz, how they remember it. And later was Gelatin Group, who actually remembers Forum Stadtpark. You see lots of phallic references. So that is all from my part, and I'm glad to pass the word to David, who will tell how he perceives Graz and this whole endeavor on steirischer Herbst in general and this year. And I'm stopping sharing my screen. So your micro, David, your micro.
Thank you, Katya. It's fantastic insight into what we've been doing so far, and really, I mean, there are some things to add, of course, but maybe I try to go through the presentation that I prepared. I have an embarrassingly structured PowerPoint with bullet points that I don't usually work that way, but I figured that we don't have much time, and I'll try to just sort of rush through it and read it a little bit and respond also to what Ekaterina was saying. So without further ado, I'll sort of launch into that. So what our gambit, so to speak, at the time of the lockdown when COVID broke out, and we sort of understood that it wouldn't be possible to travel anymore, that it wouldn't be possible to do large scale exhibitions anymore, we decided to assume the role of a broadcasting company or a media conglomerate as a costume. This was, I would say, not so much assuming the total fiction that we were now a media company and, you know, calling ourselves directors of programming and so on, but really using it as a costume that you could slip in and out of, and you could actually also still be a festival. This is something important to say maybe in the very beginning, in order to avoid the impression that we just became Netflix for contemporary art. Actually, the whole point in many ways was to straddle the in real life and the virtual, the digital consumer and streaming consumer service type of mentality, and the actual operation of a vehemently local festival, whose local importance Katja just described very, very well. So there was really in the festival throughout, and now I somehow only see part. I'm going to try to hide. No. Okay, it's really the big tension in the festival is the local festival versus its global reach that one can see, I think, quite well in this avatar of Freud that Katja was mentioning before. Actually, the actor who supplied the facial movements and the voice of this digital avatar built with an Unreal engine and then, you know, carefully modeled by 3D designers and animated, was actually involved in the festival in another way, namely as the anchorman of the news program. There was a not daily, but regular news program that was really bridging the gap between this international broadcasting that you have on a website that was and that was really working with all of the different formats of a news channel or a media channel, and this local festival. So the actor was actually even talking to himself as the avatar. There was there was a taking over of newscast formats, features. We were offering serial content, online games, and live coverage of the festival's events. So there was purely online content, but also content that was mediating what was going on in Graz. And it was, I have to say, this is also something Katja was highlighting just toward the end of her talk, that it's very different from the usual thematic curating you have at biennials. It works in a completely different way. It's rather locating things in time and in space, not just in a spatial constellation. It's trying to really engage with local audiences and also giving artists a lot of leeway and not forcing so much them into your curatorial fiction, but at the same time, still themes and threads do emerge. And I hope in the next couple of minutes, I'll try to sort of rush through some of those as we saw them. Maybe a paradigmatic artwork for the whole show in a way, and also for a new way of curating that emerges on this ground, is a film called Artworks Made at Home by Ahmet Ögut, that was shown right at the beginning of the festival, and that is in a way almost an exhibition in an exhibition. It's an artist-curated mashup from the genealogy of domestic art production, woven together in a very intuitive way and with actually a minimum of commentary, but showing this incredible wealth of works going back well into the 1960s of artistic productions that are using the home not only as an exhibition space or a studio space, but that are also making sense of it as a political terrain. It also highlights, because the film is actually not just made of, the kind of Westkunst, Western art, classical works that we might know of Martha Rossler or Ulay and Marina Abramovic, but it actually includes an entire section also with a big focus on Eastern European and Turkish art that shows, in fact, how in the domestic space can be very important as an alternative in the absence of access to official space, or the absence of this official art space. Katja was mentioning these kind of colonizing dependencies of the international art world. So the home actually becomes that, but he also talks a lot about the permeability of domestic space as a space of production. This was a response to something that we discussed with many of the artists right away, which is actually, how do we work? How do we continue to work under these lockdown conditions? How do you create artworks at home that are ambitious, that aren't just, how do you say, chamber versions of something much larger, or thought out as how do you remain public also in the domestic sphere? So these were questions that Ahmet Ögut was asking, but not in the standard kind of curatorial narrative, but in a very intuitive, woven together artistic form. We were actually very lucky to enlist one of the classics of this domestic art production at home, the filmmaker John Smith, who's been famous since the 70s for his films and video art made almost exclusively in hotel rooms or in his domestic setting. And for us, he made a new COVID series that was delving into the bad magic and many rituals warding off the pandemic in post-Brexit Britain. So there's also a bit of a connection actually to the film that from the previous festival that Ekaterina mentioned, by Jeremy Deller. Here you see this, one of the central characters, of course, of that film is, in the background and often unseen off screen, Boris Johnson, who now became this kind of chief magician of a bad magic where finance takes precedence over health. So warding off the virus with some kind of strange mantras, keeping it at bay. And these three films that he made, for an example, then came in a certain period, a period of cecity, together with much other serial content by artists. So many artists actually produced serial content. We explicitly also asked them to produce things that could be shown and screened in multiple parts and binged. So one of the questions that arose in a work that actually has a direct connection and pays homage to John Smith very directly is a work by Tamar Guimaraes, and a whole group of people where it's a making of a soap opera that aspires to intervene in the massive, let's say, passion for Bolsonaro among an impoverished electorate, so who are also watching telenovelas. And the question is really, can domestic TV production be a space for political engagement under quarantine, state of exception conditions? And they ask this question in a kind of network production of a temporary collective that spans huge geographical differences. And they do it in giving self-critical answers to these kind of classical questions of a film in a film. What does film mean politically? But in this extremely high quality of almost Netflix, that's very visually rich. So actually you have this very ambitious new work that was produced only under lockdown conditions, but with all this HD equipment that artists now have access to, where you really see that, yes, you can actually produce very cinematic work at home. And yes, you can also ask quite strong political questions. Maybe the only problem in that film, and this is, you know, a natural problem that they're also reflecting upon the whole time, is actually this isolation that's not just the quarantine isolation, but the isolation that Katja was talking about before, namely this elitism of the left that actually can't break out of its own recursive, discursive bubble. Interestingly enough, Graz collective Theater im Bahnhof was asking similar questions about domestic art production and its political efficacy in their three-part miniseries about a couple trying to make the perfect communist artwork in a co-op, in a socialist housing, social democrat housing co-op in Graz, and all of the travails that they go through, sort of negotiating the bureaucracy. This is a very beautiful realist satire, you could say, of how art also functions institutionally when it tries to write itself into public space. So this was a local echo in a way of the global political domestic art production. Another film that was very closely looking at how prosumerism works as an economy of affect was Liv Schulman's movie making of miniseries called Brown, Yellow, White, and Dead, in which she and a pretty wacky, crazy cast of characters is discussing how to make a horror movie in which a monster arises out of beer brewing, kombucha making, Tupperware parties, and takes over their sexuality. It deconstructs the sexual politics and self-exploitative violence that's often at work in these kind of prosumerist collectives when groups of neighbors get together and decide to finally produce something productively and have fun at the same time. So there's a parodying going on there that's at the same time it makes light of this homespun professionalism also of contemporary artists and reaches a very serious critique, as I think, of social reproduction and how it feeds back into the contemporary art world and how contemporary art affects that social reproduction. So this actually, I think, was a very important and very also humorous, absurdist, light film that was talking about very serious, actually economic issues. Similarly, subtle engagement with the political unconscious you could see through humor, you could see in Sergei Bratkov's series. Sergei Bratkov is an artist from Ukraine who lives in Moscow, who made also very beautiful works for the lockdown, also a series of short videos where the absurdity of domesticized and aestheticized ideology and Russian hooray patriotism is projected back into the domestic space of the kitchen through towels, and he collects this whole this panoply of very expressive, kitschy, patriotic towels, and then goes through a fake kind of art historical analysis. His last film also is very beautiful and full of a deep melancholia, showing bottles and discarded bottles in the deserted streets of Moscow after people go out and surreptitiously drink together because there's no other place to go. So there's a reflection very much also on the lockdown as an ideological effect, as something that's creating, let's say, an incredible weight of existence. And many psychopathologies, so to speak. So this was actually also something that some people working with very directly, responding to Paranoia TV and the name of Paranoia. We had Diederik Peters, an artist and theater art person from the Netherlands, from Belgium, exploring the psychopathologies flourishing under the lockdown. Or, for an example, a very beautiful small series of wordless, speechless, not wordless, but plotless videos by Rana Hamadeh that were mapping the mechanics of the tragedy of Oedipus Rex in a computer game that you can't play. So it's this very ambitious 3D space that you enter. These are I think, inner landscapes also that the lockdown sort of provoked and allowed to flourish, and that are of course were very important in the project. So not everything was so focused and, you know, following a kind of curatorial directive, but people were also doing their work and allowing things to happen. And this was one of those very beautiful works that I can highly recommend. But there were also, of course, the political nightmares that that COVID woke to even greater activity. For an example, there was a mini-series in our program daily in German, also addressing the local situation and talking about, let's say, in German language space, not only in Germany, but also in Austria, the prevalence of the new white identitarian neo-Nazi movement. His work is a dystopia about how white men secede to the southeast of Germany. And it featured daily portraits of the kind of most prominent figure of, let's say, the new right in culture and public life. Authors and prominent intellectuals were featured every day in these kind of Roman Aklef readings, and they were read by a very famous Austrian actress, Mavi Herbiger. We also had in German, for an example, a mini-series by theater duo Kvast and Knoblich, who were offering prepper DIY instructions and playing with the cheesy, kind of hard to touch language of the German alt-right and of their internet memes, and rearranging those into conceptual propositions. A lot of the work really addressed also previous premonitions. Katja already said before that our previous festival was called Grand Hotel Abyss, but I think the premonitions of the crisis were in the air for a long time. And some artists took the opportunity also to recapitulate those and to look at those more closely. For an example, there's a recapitulation and reflection of how well rehearsed these emergency responses are in Clemens von Wedemeyer's film, which actually revisits a material that he shot shortly before the outbreak of COVID, where in near Leipzig, emergency responders are rehearsing a catastrophe. And he reflects in the voiceover about how the responses, many of these responses are rehearsed and pre-programmed to the point that society itself is already absolutely prepared for a lockdown, and that really, you know, everyone knows what part they have to play. There's also a similar reworking of an older material that's really radically new, in the responsive reformatting of Neil Bilufa's prophetic mini-series about the pandemic, which he reworked as a very ambitious online video game that you can still also visit and play if you go to Paranoia TV and then click the link. It's a really interesting work because it uses online gaming essentially as an exhibition space and creates a completely new logic of introducing a curatorial narrative also. So it's actually working through an older material, adapting it to radically new exhibition positions. And for us, situation, and for us, this work was very important in a way, showing how this could be done and providing one of several paradigms sort of for what Paranoia TV could be. There were also other online games. I just thought I should briefly mention them. One of them was a sort of training program of how to go back to work finally when the lockdown would be over, where gaming becomes a metaphor of social violence in the office that's always telling you have to fall in love, you have to do this, you have to go talk to your neighbor, you have to act in a certain way. That's, by the way, also very humorously in Russian and a remake of a late Soviet comedy called Sluzhebny Roman. There was also another very interesting game that we had, which was actually, unlike all of the other things I've been talking about, which are essentially video, right? This was a pure image-free SMS-style text adventure by Alexandra Pirici, the contemporary artist and performer, choreographer, and Jonas Lund, who's somebody who's working mostly in digital media. And together they invented this really great thing that's a kind of nostalgic SMS adventure game, reminiscent of the very first computer games that ever existed, which were text adventures, where you had a simple choice between options, and then the narrative would branch out and diverge. Their story is about a pandemic that makes people extremely tired, and through their tiredness, then they cause accidents and so on. And the game itself also reenacts these tired pauses. It forces you to, it just locks your phone, for an example, and forces you to wait for some time. So actually, this is also a very beautiful little intervention that, you know, we wanted to feature those kind of games because we think they're very much a part of a new economy of attention that's emerging on these in these settings. So that was one thing that we did. One has to say, maybe I now will try to really skip a bit to the end, but I really wanted to mention also that not all artists were responding so directly. I said this already, but working with quite, you know, let's say with topics that actually do gain new relevancy maybe under the conditions of a lockdown, and making work that also worked very differently than it was originally intended because of the lockdown. So one of those works was a very ambitious film by Dani Gal, filmmaker and artist Dani Gal, based in Berlin, from Israel originally, about the politics of witnessing and memory, about the activist movement breaking the silence, in which former Israeli service members report about their own crimes that they're committing during the occupation, and juxtaposing these kind of this testimony of one of those soldiers to reenactments of episodes from the history of modernist music, essentially, where, you know, where silence plays a fundamental role, and breaking a silence plays a fundamental role. So this was a very complicated film in a way, but also told in a very, I would say, popular idiom. So getting back to the problem that Ekaterina mentioned before about how do you mediate the contents of contemporary art, of an art that has this incredible modernist tradition in its back, that where you, as you were saying before, need a PhD to attend an exhibition, where you feel the pressure, you feel a census, so to speak. How do you speak about in that language in a more popular way? How do you make it in a way that it could mediate itself? And actually, Dani Gal's film is an example for how this can be done. It's a film that tells its own story. It sounds very complicated when I sort of retell it to you now, but when you watch it, it's actually like watching a Netflix film that captivates you, and that where the actors are actually drawing you in, where there's a lot of the typical theatrics also of the streaming series that we're all addicted to. Another very interesting way of dealing with this proposal of doing works at home or working under the one thing I should say before about Dani Gal is also what's very specific about this film is that it's made in empty spaces and empty concert halls that were all under lockdown. So he was actually able to use this to great effect, to use some of Berlin's concert halls that he wouldn't usually have access to, and suddenly the film becomes very rich in scenery, rich in locations. Another way of dealing with this situation of being also stuck in one place, of not being able to travel, of not having the same intensity of scheduling, was the very beautiful miniseries and very binge-worthy miniseries that Rabia Amroué and Lina Majalani did for us, called Second Look, in which they discuss in a very poetic way their own photo archive, or the photo archive of other people's photographs that Rabia Amroué has been collecting and buying from flea markets in Berlin and other places over the years. And it's a kind of husband and wife dialogue about, you know, like, why do you collect these photos? What are you doing even collecting these photos? This is why I'm collecting these photos. That then subtly and quietly moves into the sphere actually of politics and of political memory, where they begin to speak about the situation in Beirut today, the history, the family history of Rabia, and how it's interwoven into Beirut politics. And it really, so there's a kind of sense that emerges over watching the film of the series that's very, I would say, yeah, this kind of rehearsed nostalgia, that suddenly you feel that there's a catastrophe within a catastrophe within a catastrophe unfolding before your eyes. It's a very beautiful and addictive thing that was also on Paranoia TV. And finally, I thought I should mention also a very unusual thing, that an unusual work that ended the festival practically. It was one of the last works that we showed, by Joanna Rykovska and Robert Schneiderman. Joanna Rykovska is an artist largely known for her ambitious public works and her sculptures, some performances also. And they had originally planned a performance about hunting and about bringing animals back to life, that then turned into a very ambitious deconstruction of their respective family memories, which involved hunting, forests, reanimation of animals, as I just said. But that was all, instead of them performing it directly, because they were also not able to come together because of the lockdown, all performed with handmade puppets that Joanna Rykovska made herself in collaboration with puppeteers and theater artists and film people from who she was at that moment close to, working on the script and the voiceover at a distance. So this is a very, very ambitious new work, but that was made really under studio conditions, just by going out into the forest in the immediate surroundings. And that also deals with these memory politics of, how do you reach this kind of, it basically deconstructs any possibility for any authenticity in the European memory, East, West, Jewish, non-Jewish, Holocaust, fascism, emigration, the whole complex, that there is really no authentic space to return to. And this, I thought, was a very interesting response also to our location that Katja was talking about in the beginning, about how, with a gateway to Eastern Europe or something like this, what are the terms actually that we're talking about? And is there any way to return to any authenticity in that? I don't really think so. So I very much liked that film. I should just maybe also mention that aside from all of this rich content and these works, all of which were new works that we commissioned, even those that you heard were reworkings of previous attempts, they were really fundamentally new. Other than all of these new works, we also had a very rich discussion program where we met with Zoom, with all kinds of very interesting people. We had four major conveners, people who were inviting other people. So this is actually also something we wanted to do in order to avoid a typical kind of conference structuring, where we ourselves have some large total view of what we want to address, and then handpicking those academics that we know. We instead invited artists to invite different people who they would find it, and intellectuals to find people they would find it interesting to talk to. That was one thing we did. We also collaborated with two local institutions, Forum Stadtpark, which appeared in those phallic memories of gelatin that Ekaterina mentioned just now, was one of them. They did a conference about utopia in present days. And the other one was the Literaturhaus that did a conference about literature in post-COVID times that was called This Time is Out of Joint. And that's the first of an ongoing series. So those ongoing collaborations are actually with locals are just as important as, the international art talk with Achille Membe, let's say. There's a balance, I think, in the festival that's very important to keep between those two sides. So I hope I haven't, okay, I won't go into Silvia Federici and Graeber now. I should maybe just mention that at that conference, that there is something like a theoretical compass that one could established. And I guess everyone has to sort of look for their own, because we didn't supply it in the way that one usually does in thematically curated exhibitions. So we didn't say, for example, you know, according to this and this theorist, things are like this, and according to that theorist, things are like that, and we want to discuss that and this. This is kind of the standard way, but you could find in the program certain, you know, orientation points. So for me personally, to sort of make sense of all of this, also vis-a-vis domestic art production, vis-a-vis the crisis, what theory, what role theory and you know, reflection can even play in all of that, and how it relates back to the actual work of making art. Those two talks, maybe, or two presences, were very important. One was there was Silvia Federici in the Forum Stadtpark conference, who spoke very poignantly about, yeah, I would say the threat of isolation and the need for collaboration, the need for for a new definition of the commons, for renewed attention also to the work of reproduction and the labor of reproduction that takes place beyond the recognition of the public sphere in the homes. So this is something that very much has to do with those artworks made at home that I mentioned at the very beginning. And the other presence that was sort of in the project, but that more as a ghost, literally, sadly, was David Graeber, who we were working on very intensively on a project about care. You mentioned Joanna in the very beginning. About new ways of rethinking care economies and care social structures, and visualizing that in a very interesting combination of online assembly and stencil making in public space. Unfortunately, David Graeber died, as you know, on September 2nd. And so we hosted, in the end, his funeral carnival, which was a big international event all over the world, and where people were really also explaining how important for them David Graeber's work over decades had been in making sense of the present moment, actually. So that was, I think if we think about a little bit about also what is this non-thematic curating involve and how does it work? It involves a lot of care not in a kind of cheesy sense, but in the sense of actually establishing structures of how to work with artists, how to bring things out of artists that aren't necessarily related to a grand, let's say, narrated imperative from above. One can work that way, and we have ourselves worked that way, but I think this time I agree fully with Kato, it was very different. I hope I've given you not too much information, and yeah, that's pretty much it for me. So thank you for your time and attention. And we're ready for questions, I guess.
And thank you, David. It's a very inspiring. Please, if you have some questions, type in. And while you're typing, I just wanted to share with you, during the lockdown in Melbourne, we used to also order the food all the time. And courier will just like drop the box in front of your door, and I would just see him coming down the stairs. And whenever I see him coming down, I will think of, like, can you imagine if this box is an exhibition, you know? If I could just look at the exhibition at this point. And in 2004, there was a beautiful exhibition in Shanghai organized by artists, which was called Dial and then Phone Number. So it was a courier exhibition. They trained like 7, 8, 9, 10 couriers. There was an exhibition in a suitcase, and you phone and you say your address, and then courier comes to your place and show you the work. There was a big group exhibition of 40-something artists that was happening for 15 years. So for 15 days in Shanghai. And that exhibition, like whenever I see my box of the food coming in, I would say, oh, why don't someone, you know, use this courier to do something different? And I'm happy that Ekaterina, you just mentioned briefly, you use this food delivery chain to kind of insert certain projects. So I just wanted to maybe ask you a question. I see a lot of video works, and A lot of it's probably streamed on Paranoia webpage, I assume, and some of the public space. But whether you thought of strategies of how to reach for the people who are maybe not necessarily like elderly, who don't maybe use internet, like how some of the content, did you use some strategies to think how that content could reach them, maybe?
Well, actually, in my experience, the elderly are kind of the reference public of steirischer Herbst, unfortunately. As I said, this festival has a long tradition in town, and so there is lots of audience who are visiting it since 80s at least. And actually, they do have internet. Yeah, that's we also created the app. The app is rather for younger people, but we also had a possibility to watch it at our headquarters. But I would say that the vulnerable, maybe in that sense, are maybe not the old, but the poor. I don't know. This is an interesting question to me, how to be accessible, you know, for instance, this performance with taxis of us, it's enormously criticized for many reasons. And one of them is for being elitist. But we actually used taxis in order not to be elitist, because otherwise we would say, you know, everybody is free to come with their own car. I don't own a car, for instance. You know, or kind of many people do not own cars, so they cannot afford it, or they don't even drive, as I don't. So that would be, I think, very elitist when you say, like, come with your own car, and very American, you know, thing. This is why I don't live in America, because I don't drive, you know, so I feel that I'm not welcome there. But then, you know, there's still the idea that taxis are also elitist. I don't like the word elitist, actually. I also don't really like the word popular. What I like is to be accessible. But how to be really accessible? Yeah, this is true. So I had to adjust to the idea of an app, for instance. But David will say more, but I think this is how one has to do things with art now. And internet is becoming like, you know, like electricity. It's we cannot live without electricity. I can imagine that there are maybe some places in the world where there is no electricity, but this is unfortunate, and that has to be kind of, you know, corrected somehow. Same thing with internet, I guess.
Yeah, I think there, one of the works that Katja briefly mentioned about Anna Witt's work, which was one, it was shown briefly as a projection of against a wall of close-ups of human body, and this was a work that was made actually by an intergenerational group, which means that the artist is young and all the people who were participating are senior citizens, so older women living in village actually nearby Graz. So you can see that they were having bi-weekly Zoom meetings, making video art with the artist through Zoom, you know, like that doesn't work that way. I agree with Katja that maybe the big thing is rich and poor, and also language. So one of our efforts was to have enough content in German, which is not usually the case, right? I mean, mostly you have English language content, and a festival like this wouldn't have so much in the local language in order to stay international. We also did subtitles and to be accessible, more accessible. You know, so there are things you can do. You can try to push works in a new form. There was also, you know, steirischer Herbst has quite active mediation program that's also trying to bring then, you know, the artists into play, even in some cases, and having dialogues with, you know, via this kind of pedagogy strategy. So I think in that sense there was, you know, there's something to build on, and there's also there's much further to go, but a lot of it also depends on the work itself. And I think some things are easier to mediate than others. I think humor works a lot of the time is more accessible and more open when it's not a kind of in-humor, you know, like when it's not self-referential and talking only to art people, but when it's actually funny because it's existentially funny, that works much better. But my sense is that, you know, that we still have quite a ways to go with that. That's a wish, you know, to be popular, or as you say, accessible.
Yeah, on the other hand, that was, please let's not forget that that was all for free.
Yes.
In that sense, you know, as long as you have an internet, is actually, you don't have to pay for that. As I said, you know, it was a contrast with the previous festival.
Thank you. We have a question from Christoph. I'm going to read it.
Biljana, sorry, can I say some small thing for our Facebook viewers? If they, if you will have some questions, you can put on the comments, and I will.
Thank you, Aigerim. So if you have a question, just put it in the comments in the Facebook, and then we will read for you. Thanks. We have a question from Christoph. Thanks a lot to both of you. This was very generous. Can you talk more about response to the local public in Graz? Was the imposed online lockdown format of this year's festival beneficial to reach more local public?
Well, to the last part of the question, I still don't know, actually, because we have numbers. Our numbers for, you know, online audience are enormous. We didn't even expect, but how many of them are from Graz, I cannot tell. But I heard, I was afraid that people in Graz would not watch it at all, but they did. I know that they did, and as I said, the festival is a part of the local, you know, history. They all know about it. And as I'm usually saying, I've heard the reaction of someone who looks at some, I don't know, you know, garbage in the street and says, that's probably steirischer herbst. This is what they do. And I find this reaction actually the best, because that means that there is someone who knows that there is such a thing as steirischer herbst, who kind of knows what they do. He disapproves, which is also fine. But it's part of the local kind of imagination. In that sense, it's good that we had this, you know, headquarters at the main street. That was very appreciated by the locals. The presence in town. They still have to learn to live vicariously, but I think we all have to. And this is a big question, I think, for all of us, because we're using, you know, especially art people, we are using this international communication. I'm talking to you sitting in Melbourne, and tomorrow I will be talking to someone sitting, I don't know, in Tokyo. This is totally normal for us, but I don't know, we have to think how that sort of thing has to be put together with these local expectations. Because yes, there were people who were disappointed that we were not that present in real life, but it was a force majeure. It's like they also had to understand, and that they actually, yeah, this is how it was. And I guess to some extent we have to go in this direction, not completely remaining digital, of course, but exploring it more, I guess. I don't know, David, what is your impression?
So there was just a few, you know, basic practical things in a way that we didn't mention. We did something that's in a way new. We had an outreach, a very strong collaboration, a daily podcast made by Ö1. Ö1 is the cultural radio station, the largest in Europe, actually, the state-run Austrian culture radio station. So they had a huge effort of covering our program, and that reached listeners of the radio just in general. So actually there was more outreach than usual. That was also, to answer the question very concretely, whether the lockdown helped. Yeah, it definitely helped, because they don't have as much content. They don't have Salzburg to cover. They don't have this to cover. They don't have that to cover. So we got, you know, like a pretty good primetime spot on Ö1. That was very important, I think, as an outreach to the local public who's also older, who maybe doesn't hear about, you know, doesn't read e-flux or whatever, and that isn't aware of what the art world is doing in Graz also. The question of local response, I leave that to, like Katya's word has to be the last on that, because I'm not there, so I don't know. But my sense, just from what I've heard, is that I was surprised at how positive it was. I was expecting way more blowback. As in terms of, maybe to answer that from an international point, I was also surprised at how we were actually able, given that the festival is quite local and that usually it involves travel, seeing it, usually and receiving it at all, usually involves traveling to Graz and also engaging with that locale. And that's what it's for in a way. No? The response to this thing was internationally was very good. So we had lots of viewers that wouldn't have ordinarily traveled to Graz, but were actually sitting and watching this. And that's also, for me, important. I think, if you turn that proposition of local, cosmopolitan elites versus local popular audience, you could turn that proposition around and you could say that, traveling, there's a, not everyone who is interested in contemporary art is able to travel. Not everyone belongs to the jet set. And there are a lot of people who were stuck in place even before, in some provincial Russian city, for whom, of course, online visits of exhibitions are also very important. So it's not just, that it's a kind of, we'd make an in real life event to sort of throw a bone to the local audiences, and we ourselves are more interested in broadcasting it to the world. But there's also so I think, it's important to navigate that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, I just want to point out, we often talk about this, being more inclusive in general for everybody, including, like, let's say, disabled people. I was myself in my youth, I was kind of culturally disabled. I was in Soviet Union and I was studying, international culture, including contemporary art, but I knew that I will never travel at that point. I was totally locked down inside this, of course, huge country, but still, and what could have helped me enormously have been internet, of course. And the internet of that time, that was radio, that were books, and that was my life. That was actually how I lived. So, and what I lived for, to read that, to hear that. And I can imagine that people, they are stuck at home now for different reasons. And we are all kind of disabled now. Yeah, so many of us cannot leave the apartment. So we might maybe understand how my grandfather, for instance, lived, who was disabled and could not leave the apartment for many, many years. So and I think that one has to value these possibilities that it gives us. So it actually contributes to more equality in some way.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions, Ekaterina, maybe on your side on Facebook?
No.
No. So maybe just a last question from me, because we know that this is not going to end this year. And you're preparing, I'm sure, the next festival because it's an annual thing. Like, what are your thoughts and what are your strategies that you kind of accumulated this year that you will maybe continue exploring throughout the next year?
Yeah, it's still, of course, I'm still under shock that it still continues and nobody knows when it will actually end and how. And of course, it affects all the, performative program. I think, as I said, we saw positive, parts of this online presence, but one has to work on it artistically as well to somehow explore it. This is the only thing I can say, that we definitely have to keep those both levels. Like, our all preparation materials this year, they were divided into in real life and online. And I think that we have to think in this direction, because we did documentation before, of course, like everybody, but that was appearing online. Let's say a video of a performance was appearing online, after a couple of months, but this is not the same. One has to do it in the same time And one has to think about it as also an artistic form. It's interesting if there are artists who can do this. I don't know what David, but at the same time, in real life is also necessary, I would say. So this tactile moment, this eroticism of being together is something which we, I think, all missing very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's very important, though. What's emerged for me out of this is the need also for new curatorial models, that like the monographic curating that we were all used to, or the curating of social sculptures as a kind of, you know, as a very tight collectivity. Those two models somehow are very dysfunctional at the moment, and it maybe also has to do something to do with the lack of presence forms, you know, like the lack of live formats, so that it becomes, it's much more challenging and more interesting. I agree that also this, you know, virtual, real, digital, analog question is still going to be, it needs to be much more deeply explored. And maybe not so much in a philosophical, you know, like not to philosophize about it more and to create a theory of it, but actually to find ways of working very, you know, in a kind of non-flashy and you know, very functional way. How do you add access? How do you create these kind of simultaneous events that are both local and, you know, broadcasting? This is something that people will inevitably work with. And I think some artists actually are. Some artists are very successfully straddling that gap. It's going to be more and more because this is our reality. This is what we live in. But that's not, you know, that's certainly not a thematic focus or a program or whatever that we're ready to announce. We're not there yet at all. So,
but I think we have lots of things to rethink. That even, yeah, I agree with David, but there are also lots of things that go way beyond that issue. Like, is it in public space or is it on the screen? You know, I don't know, the world is changing drastically right now. And I'm afraid to say that maybe contemporary art with its lineage from modernism and avant-garde maybe belongs to the previous world. It doesn't mean that it has to be like canceled. I'm not for this cancel culture, but it has to be rethought, definitely. So there are many things in what we do that they are somehow kind of, I don't know, sometimes I do regret this old world. What can I say? You know, I was watching yesterday Jeeves and Wooster, you know, which I do watch sometimes. And, you know, according to contemporary world, it has to be like completely canceled because it's a monument to white privilege, to male patriarchy, to all that sort of stuff which we hate. At the same time, I love it, so entertaining. And I would very much regret if we would like cancel it. So I don't know, but if we go, like, if we are consistent, like everything has to be canceled, including contemporary art. But I hope still that we can find a way.
Okay. I agree.
Thank you so much. So we should call it an end here. Thank you, Ekaterina and David, for generosity with the time and sharing and everything. And I see you at the workshop next week.
Yes.
And thank you.
Thank you. And also next week we have next public lecture by Natasha.
Yes, thank you, Aigerim, for reminding me. We have a last lecture in 2020 by Natasha Petreshin-Bacheles, which is on which date?
15.
15 of December. Please look at our Facebook and website. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.